What if I told you that America once made a single trade decision that cost the economy over $2 trillion and fundamentally altered the global balance of power? Before we dive into this story that will shock you, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening content about America's economic history. In the year 2000, the United States Congress made what many economists now consider the most catastrophic trade mistake in American history. With overwhelming bipartisan support, they voted to grant China permanent normal trade relations status, essentially opening the floodgates for Chinese goods to pour into American markets with minimal restrictions. This wasn't just another trade deal, it was a decision that would reshape the entire global economy and lead to consequences that we're still dealing with today. The promise was simple. Integrating China into the global trading system would create American jobs, boost economic growth, and potentially even democratize the world's most populous nation. American politicians, economists, and business leaders painted a rosy picture of mutual prosperity. What actually happened was something entirely different: a massive transfer of American manufacturing capacity, jobs, and economic power to China that would leave entire communities devastated and America's industrial base hollowed out. This is the story of how America's biggest trade mistake ever came to be, and why its effects continue to reverberate through our economy and society more than 2 decades later. To understand how this monumental mistake happened, we need to go back to the aftermath of the Cold War. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, America found itself as the world's sole superpower. The prevailing wisdom in Washington was that free trade and economic integration would spread democracy and create a more peaceful world. China in the 1990s was still a relatively poor country, with a GDP per capita of just over $400. Most Americans couldn't even imagine that this agricultural nation would one day challenge American economic supremacy. Chinese manufacturing was primitive, their technology was decades behind, and their political system seemed increasingly isolated. But China's leaders had a different vision. Following Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms that began in the late 1970s, China was quietly building the foundation for what would become the world's factory. They were investing heavily in infrastructure, education, and manufacturing capabilities, while American policymakers were focused on the dot-com boom and the promise of a service-based economy. The turning point came when China began seriously pursuing membership in the World Trade Organization. For decades, China had held most favored nation trading status with the United States, but this had to be renewed annually by Congress, a process that often involved heated debates about China's human rights record and trade practices. Granting permanent normal trade relations would remove this annual uncertainty and pave the way for China's WTO membership. American business leaders were salivating at the prospect of accessing China's massive consumer market of over 1 billion people. The key policy that enabled America's biggest trade mistake was the granting of permanent normal trade relations to China, signed into law by President Bill Clinton in October 2000. This legislation, known as PNTR, passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 237 to 197 and the Senate by 83 to 15. Showing remarkable bipartisan support despite some vocal opposition. PNTR fundamentally changed the trade relationship between the two nations. Under the previous system, China's trading status had to be renewed annually, giving Congress leverage to address concerns about human rights, labor practices, and trade imbalances. With PNTR, these annual reviews disappeared, and China gained permanent access to the same low tariffs enjoyed by America's closest trading partners. The legislation was coupled with China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001, which further reduced barriers to Chinese exports. American negotiators believed they had secured important concessions from China, including commitments to open their markets to American goods and services, protect intellectual property rights, and allow greater foreign investment in key sectors. But the devil was in the details, or rather in what wasn't included in the details. The agreement lacked strong enforcement mechanisms for many of China's commitments. There were no automatic penalties for currency manipulation, no effective safeguards against state-subsidized competition, and no meaningful protection against the theft of American intellectual property. Perhaps most critically, American policymakers failed to anticipate how China would use state-directed capitalism to gain unfair advantages in global markets. They assumed that China would play by the same free market rules that governed other major economies. The economic consequences of America's trade mistake with China began almost immediately and grew more severe with each passing year. Within just 5 years of granting PNTR, the United States trade deficit with China more than doubled, jumping from $84 billion in 2000 to over $200 billion by 2005. By 2018, it had ballooned to an astronomical $419 billion. But the trade deficit was just the tip of the iceberg. American manufacturing employment, which had remained relatively stable through the 1990s, went into freefall after 2001. The country lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2010, with many of these losses directly attributable to competition from Chinese imports. Entire industries that had been the backbone of American communities for generations simply vanished. The human cost was staggering. Factory towns across the Midwest and South became economic ghost towns almost overnight. Workers who had spent decades perfecting their skills found themselves competing against Chinese laborers, earning a fraction of their wages. Many never found comparable employment again, leading to a cascade of social problems including increased rates of depression, substance abuse, and family breakdown. The impact wasn't limited to blue-collar workers. American companies found themselves forced to either move production to China or go out of business entirely. Even companies that tried to remain competitive by investing in automation and efficiency improvements often couldn't match the combination of low Chinese labor costs and government subsidies that made Chinese products artificially cheap. Meanwhile, China was using the massive trade surplus to fund infrastructure projects, military expansion, and technological development that would eventually challenge American dominance in key industries. The global reaction to America's trade relationship with China was mixed, but it fundamentally altered international economic dynamics in ways that few anticipated. European allies initially welcomed China's integration into the global trading system, seeing it as an opportunity to expand their own export markets. However, they soon discovered that China was not playing by the same rules. Before we continue with this crucial part of the story, I want to remind you to hit that like button. If you're finding this information valuable, share it with others who need to understand this history, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our future videos on America's economic challenges. Other developing nations found themselves squeezed out of global supply chains as China's massive scale and government backing allowed Chinese manufacturers to underbid competitors around the world. Countries that had been building their own manufacturing sectors suddenly found their products priced out of international markets. This wasn't just competition. It was competition backed by the full resources of the Chinese state. Japan and South Korea, despite their own competitive manufacturing sectors, began to see their market share eroded in key industries. Even Germany, with its reputation for high-quality engineering and manufacturing, started losing ground in sectors where Chinese companies could offer similar products at dramatically lower prices. The global financial system also felt the impact. China's massive trade surpluses led to an accumulation of foreign currency reserves that reached over $4 trillion by 2014. This gave China unprecedented influence over global financial markets and the ability to weaponize economic relationships for political purposes. Perhaps most concerning was how other nations began to view the American model of free trade and open markets. To understand the real-world impact of America's trade mistake, let's examine specific case studies that illustrate how communities and industries were affected. Take Youngstown, Ohio, once a thriving steel town that employed over 100,000 people in manufacturing. After PNTR and China's WTO accession, cheap Chinese steel flooded American markets, undercutting local producers who couldn't compete with state-subsidized Chinese companies. By 2010, Youngstown's population had shrunk by over 60% from its peak, with boarded-up houses and abandoned factories marking what was once America's steel heartland. Similar stories played out in towns across Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and dozens of other states. These weren't just economic statistics, they represented the destruction of entire ways of life. The furniture industry provides another stark example. North Carolina had been America's furniture capital for over a century, with skilled craftsmen producing high-quality wooden furniture. Chinese manufacturers, often using illegally harvested timber and paying workers less than $1 per hour, began flooding the market with furniture that sold for a fraction of the price of American-made products. Within a decade, over 2/3 of American furniture manufacturing jobs had disappeared. Companies that had been family-owned for generations were forced to either move production to China or close their doors forever. The knowledge and skills that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen were lost, seemingly forever. Even high-tech industries weren't immune. American companies that moved production to China to take advantage of lower costs soon found their Chinese partners had become their competitors, often using stolen intellectual property and technology. The long-term effects of America's trade mistake with China extended far beyond immediate job losses and factory closures. Perhaps most significantly, it accelerated the hollowing out of America's industrial base and created dangerous dependencies on Chinese supply chains that became painfully apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic hit in early 2020, Americans discovered that China controlled the production of critical goods ranging from pharmaceutical ingredients to personal protective equipment. The country that had once been capable of producing massive quantities of military equipment during World War II found itself unable to manufacture enough face masks for its own healthcare workers. The mistake also contributed to growing income inequality in America. While some Americans benefited from cheaper consumer goods, the workers who lost their jobs to Chinese competition often never recovered their previous earning power. This created a growing divide between educated professionals who benefited from globalization and working-class Americans who bore its costs. China used its growing economic power to build political influence around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative, funded largely by trade surpluses earned from American consumers, extended Chinese influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Countries that had traditionally looked to America for leadership began orienting themselves toward Beijing. Technologically, the consequences were equally severe. American companies that transferred production to China were often required to share sensitive technologies as part of joint venture agreements. This technology transfer, combined with widespread intellectual property theft, allowed China to rapidly advance in critical industries, including telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. Defenders of America's China trade policy argue that the decision to grant PNTR was still the right choice, despite its costs. They point out that American consumers benefited enormously from access to cheaper Chinese goods, effectively giving every American family a substantial increase in purchasing power. A typical American household, they argue, saved thousands of dollars per year by being able to buy inexpensive Chinese-made clothing, electronics, and household goods. They also contend that the policy helped lift hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty, which was both morally important and strategically beneficial for global stability. A prosperous China, they argued, would be less likely to engage in military adventurism and more likely to become a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Furthermore, supporters argue that many of the job losses attributed to Chinese competition were actually the result of technological advancement and automation. American manufacturing productivity increased dramatically during this period, suggesting that factories were becoming more efficient rather than simply moving overseas. However, these arguments have significant weaknesses. While consumers did benefit from lower prices, this came at the cost of good-paying jobs for millions of Americans. The savings on consumer goods were far outweighed by the losses in wages and economic opportunity for affected communities. The argument about lifting Chinese people out of poverty, while admirable in its humanitarian goals, ignored the strategic implications of strengthening a potential rival. China used its growing economic power not to become a responsible stakeholder, but to challenge American leadership and promote an authoritarian alternative to democratic governance. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, there were several alternative approaches that could have avoided or minimized the negative consequences of America's trade relationship with China. The most obvious would have been to maintain the annual review process for China's trading status, giving Congress continued leverage to address unfair trade practices and human rights concerns. A more sophisticated approach would have been to grant China normal trading relations, only in exchange for verifiable commitments to fair trade practices. This could have included enforceable provisions against currency manipulation, requirements for genuine market access reciprocity, and strong protections for intellectual property rights with automatic penalties for violations. The United States could have also insisted on a gradual phase-in of normal trading relations, allowing American industries and workers time to adjust to increased competition. Rather than opening the floodgates all at once, a measured approach could have given American manufacturers time to modernize and become more competitive. Perhaps most importantly, America could have invested heavily in its own industrial capacity, infrastructure, and worker retraining programs to ensure that American workers could compete in the global economy. Countries like Germany and Japan managed to maintain strong manufacturing sectors while engaging in global trade because they never abandoned their commitment to industrial policy and worker development. The United States could have also built stronger alliances with other democratic nations to present a united front in trade negotiations with China. By acting unilaterally, America gave up significant leverage that could have been used to ensure fair trading relationships. America's decision to grant China permanent normal trade relations in 2000 stands as perhaps the most consequential trade mistake in the nation's history. What was sold as a win-win opportunity for mutual prosperity instead became a one-sided transfer of American economic power that hollowed out the nation's industrial base and strengthened a strategic rival. The human cost of this mistake cannot be measured solely in economic terms. Entire communities were destroyed, generations of industrial knowledge were lost, and millions of American workers saw their paths to middle-class prosperity disappear. The social and political consequences of these economic disruptions continue to shape American politics and society today. The strategic implications were equally severe. By enabling China's rapid economic rise without extracting meaningful concessions on fair trade practices or political reform, America inadvertently funded the growth of its greatest strategic competitor. China used American consumer dollars to build military capabilities, extend global influence, and develop technologies that now challenge American leadership in critical industries. However, this story also contains important lessons for the future. It demonstrates the critical importance of maintaining America's industrial capacity, the dangers of becoming overly dependent on foreign supply chains, and the need for trade policies that protect American workers while engaging with the global economy. The mistake with China shows that trade policy is too important to be left to economists and business leaders alone. It requires careful consideration of strategic, social, and political factors that go far beyond simple economic calculations. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video, share it with others who need to understand this critical piece of American economic history, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of the forces shaping our economy and our future. Understanding our past mistakes is the first step toward building a better economic future for all Americans.